When that big thing came rushing, I screamed so loud I nearly scared myself to death. I'm not exaggerating. The sound that came out of my mouth that night was something I didn't even know I was capable of producing. A scream that started somewhere deep in my belly, clawed its way up through my chest, and exploded out of my throat with a force that made my own ears ring. A scream that probably woke up half the neighborhood and sent every stray cat within a mile running for cover. I swear to you, I had never seen anything come in that fast. Not in all my 75 years of living. Not in all the decades I spent in this house, raising children, growing old with my husband, learning every creak and groan of these wooden floors. Nothing had ever burst through my door like that. Nothing had ever made me feel so small, so vulnerable, so absolutely certain that my time had finally come. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what happens when you're my age, and a memory grabs hold of you. It pulls you right back into the moment, makes you live it all over again, whether you want to or not. And this particular memory, this night that changed everything, it grabs me often. Usually when I'm sitting on my porch in the evening, watching the light fade over the mountains, wondering how life can turn on such small, unexpected hinges. My name is Margaret Ellsworth, but everyone around here calls me Maggie. Always have, ever since I was a little girl with pigtails and scraped knees, running around my grandmother's farm in eastern Washington. My mother used to say that Margaret was too big a name for such a small child, and Maggie just fit better. The name stuck. 75 years later, I still turn my head when someone calls it out. I was born in a tiny town about 60 miles from here, the daughter of a wheat farmer and a school teacher. We didn't have much growing up, but we had books. Lord, did we have books? My mother made sure of that. She believed that books were the doorway to every life you'd never get to live, every place you'd never get to visit, every person you'd never get to meet. And she passed that belief on to me like an inheritance more valuable than money. That's why I became a librarian. Spent 43 years working at the Spokane Public Library, first as a clerk shelving books in the stacks, then as a reference librarian helping people find answers to questions they didn't even know how to ask. I loved that job. Loved the smell of old paper. Loved the quiet hum of people reading. Loved watching children discover stories for the first time, their eyes going wide with wonder. I met Arthur at the library, actually. He came in one autumn afternoon looking for a book on fly fishing, and I helped him find it, even though I didn't know the first thing about fish or flies, or why anyone would want to stand in cold water for hours trying to catch something they were just going to throw back anyway. But Arthur explained it to me, explained it with such passion, such joy, that I found myself agreeing to go with him to the river that weekend, just to see what all the fuss was about. I never did learn to fish, but I learned to love the man who loved it, and that was enough. We got married 8 months later, in a small ceremony at the Presbyterian church where my mother had been married, and her mother before her. Arthur wore a suit that was slightly too big in the shoulders, and I wore my grandmother's dress that was slightly too tight in the waist, and neither of us cared because we were too busy looking at each other, too busy being amazed that we had found something so rare, so precious, in such an ordinary place as a library. We had 41 years together, Arthur and I. Raised 2 children in this very house, a boy named William, who now lives in Portland with his wife and teaches high school history, and a girl named Catherine who moved to Boston and became a lawyer and calls me every Sunday evening without fail. Good children, good lives. Arthur and I did something right with them, even if we weren't always sure what we were doing at the time. Arthur passed 12 years ago. Cancer. The quick kind, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare, that takes someone from diagnosis to gone in a matter of months. One day he was standing in the kitchen making his famous scrambled eggs, and 3 months later I was standing at his grave trying to remember how to breathe. The first years without him were the hardest. I won't pretend otherwise. There were mornings when I couldn't find a reason to get out of bed, nights when the silence of the house pressed down on me like a physical weight. I thought about selling the place, moving somewhere smaller, somewhere that didn't echo with memories of the man I'd lost. But I couldn't do it. This house was all I had left of him. These walls had heard his laughter, these floors had felt his footsteps, this porch had held us both on countless summer evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky. So I stayed. I learned to live alone, which is different from learning to be lonely. I developed routines, rituals, small anchors that kept me tethered to a life that sometimes felt like it was drifting away. Tea at 6 in the morning, the same chamomile blend Arthur used to buy me. Reading on the porch until the light faded. Tending my garden, talking to my tomatoes like they could hear me. Going to bed early because the nights were long enough without stretching them out. And every evening before I settled in for the night, I locked the sliding door that led to the back porch, checked it twice, sometimes 3 times, because a woman living alone can never be too careful. But that night, the night everything changed, I must not have checked carefully enough, because something got in, something big. The day had started like any other. I woke up at 5:30, the way I always do, my body's internal clock refusing to let me sleep past dawn, no matter how late I'd stayed up the night before. Arthur used to tease me about it, called me his little rooster, said I was more reliable than any alarm clock he'd ever owned. I lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to the house settle around me, the creak of the old wooden beams, the soft whisper of wind against the windows, the distant sound of a car passing on the road outside. These were the sounds of my life now, the sounds of solitude. I had learned to find comfort in them, even if they could never replace the sound of another person breathing beside me. When I finally got up, I went through my morning routine with the practiced ease of someone who has done the same things in the same order for more years than she can count. Bathroom first, then kitchen. Fill the kettle, set it on the stove, get the chamomile tea from the cabinet where I always keep it. While the water heated, I stood at the window and watched the sky lighten over the Spokane Hills. That slow transition from purple to pink to gold that never gets old no matter how many times you see it. The weather forecast had mentioned rain, nothing unusual for Washington in October. We're used to gray skies and drizzle here, used to carrying umbrellas and wearing waterproof jackets 9 months out of the year. But the forecast had also mentioned wind, strong gusts coming down from the north, the kind that knock over garbage cans and send lawn chairs flying across yards. I made a mental note to bring in the cushions from the porch furniture before nightfall. Arthur had bought those cushions for me the summer before he got sick. A cheerful blue and white stripe that reminded me of beach umbrellas and happier times. I didn't want them getting soaked and ruined. The morning passed quietly. I read for a while, a mystery novel that Catherine had sent me for my birthday. I did some light cleaning, the kind of puttering that fills time without exhausting energy. I called my friend Dorothy from church to confirm our lunch plans for Thursday. Normal things, ordinary things, the small activities that make up a life when you're 75 and living alone. Around noon, I noticed the sky starting to darken. The clouds rolling in from the north were thick and heavy, the kind that mean business. The wind was picking up too, making the trees in my backyard sway and bend in ways that always made me nervous. I had seen too many storms knock down branches, damage roofs, leave whole neighborhoods without power for days. I went outside to secure what needed securing. The porch cushions came in first, as planned. Then, I moved a few potted plants closer to the house where they would be protected from the worst of the wind. I made sure the gate to the backyard was latched properly, and I checked that the garbage cans were weighted down with bricks the way Arthur had taught me years ago. By the time I finished, the first drops of rain were starting to fall. Cold drops, sharp against my skin, carried sideways by gusts that seemed to come from every direction at once. I hurried back inside, slightly out of breath, my joints complaining about all the bending and lifting. The afternoon grew darker. The rain intensified, drumming against the roof with a rhythm that would have been soothing under other circumstances. But the wind kept howling, rattling the windows, making the whole house feel less solid than it should. I turned on some lights to chase away the gloom, put on a pot of soup for dinner, tried to focus on my book. But I couldn't concentrate. Something felt off. A nervousness I couldn't explain, a prickling at the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the storm outside. I told myself I was being silly. An old woman spooked by bad weather, nothing more. But the feeling persisted. Around 6 o'clock, I heard a crash from the backyard. I jumped up from my chair, heart pounding, and hurried to the window. It was hard to see anything through the rain-streaked glass, but after a moment I spotted the source of the noise. The old wooden trellis that Arthur had built for my climbing roses had blown over, taking a section of fencing with it. I sighed. More damage to repair, more expense I hadn't budgeted for. But at least it was just the trellis. At least it wasn't the roof, or a tree through the window, or any of the other disasters that storms could bring. I went back to my chair, tried to return to my book, but the words kept swimming on the page, refusing to arrange themselves into meaning. The wind was louder now, screaming around the corners of the house like something alive and angry. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. I found myself staring at the sliding door that led to the back porch, watching the rain lash against the glass. Had I locked it? I couldn't remember. I got up to check. The lock was in place, the little lever turned to the closed position. But something still felt wrong. The door seemed loose somehow, like it wasn't sitting quite right in its frame. I jiggled the handle. It moved more than it should have. That's when I heard it. A sound from the porch, barely audible over the storm. A heavy thump, like something large landing on the wooden boards. Then another, and another. Footsteps. Someone was on my porch. I froze with my hand still on the door handle. The footsteps on the porch were heavy, deliberate. Not the quick patter of a raccoon or the skittering of a squirrel seeking shelter from the storm. These were the footsteps of something big, something that had weight to it, something that was moving slowly, carefully, like it was looking for something, or someone. My mind started racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. A burglar, casing the house, waiting for the storm to cover the sound of breaking in. A homeless person, desperate for shelter, willing to do anything to get out of the cold. Some stranger with intentions I didn't even want to imagine. The news was full of stories about elderly people living alone, targeted because they were easy victims. Was I about to become one of those stories? I backed away from the door, my hands trembling so badly I had to clasp them together to make them stop. The phone. I needed to get to the phone. Call 911, tell them someone was trying to break into my house. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what all the safety guides say. Don't confront, don't engage, just call for help and wait. But the phone was in the kitchen, on the other side of the living room. To get to it, I would have to walk past the sliding door, past whoever or whatever was on the other side of that rain-streaked glass. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was silent except for the howling wind and the pounding rain. I held my breath, straining to hear, every nerve in my body pulled tight as a guitar string. Maybe they had gone. Maybe they had decided my house wasn't worth the trouble and moved on to somewhere else. Then I heard breathing. Heavy, labored breathing, right on the other side of the door. Close enough that if the glass weren't there, I could have reached out and touched whatever was making that sound. I could see nothing through the rain and the darkness, just vague shapes and shadows that my imagination turned into monsters. I should have run, should have gone to the bedroom, locked the door, hidden in the closet like a child. But fear does strange things to you. It roots you to the spot, turns your legs to concrete, makes your brain forget every sensible thing it ever knew. I just stood there, staring at that door, watching the handle, waiting for it to move. It moved. Slowly at first, just a slight jiggle, like someone testing it. Then more forcefully, rattling in the frame. I had locked it. I was sure I had locked it, but the door was old, the mechanism was worn, and Arthur wasn't here anymore to fix things properly. The rattling stopped. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, and then the door slid open. Not all the way. Just a few inches, just enough for the cold wind and rain to come rushing in. just enough for me to see that the lock had given way, had failed me when I needed it most. The gap was dark, empty, but I knew something was there. I could feel it, could sense its presence the way you sense a storm before it breaks. I finally found my voice. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I've called the police. They're on their way." A lie, a desperate lie. But what else could I do? No answer. Just that heavy breathing, closer now, and another sound. A low rumble, almost like thunder, but not quite. Something organic, something alive. I looked around frantically for anything I could use to defend myself. The fireplace poker was too far away. The kitchen knives were in the other room. All I had within reach was a heavy glass vase on the side table, a wedding gift from Arthur's mother that I had always found ugly but kept out of obligation. I grabbed it, held it up like a weapon. My arms were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could swing it if I needed to, but at least it was something. At least I wasn't completely helpless. "I'm warning you," I said, my voice cracking. "I'll hurt you. I will." The door slid open wider, and something came through. It was big. That was the first thing I registered. Bigger than anything I had expected, bigger than any person had a right to be. It was dark and wet and moving fast, so fast that I couldn't make out any details, couldn't see a face or hands or anything that would tell me what I was dealing with. It crossed the threshold in one swift movement, bringing the storm with it. Water sprayed everywhere, splattering the floor, the furniture, me. The cold hit me like a physical blow, sharp and sudden, stealing what little breath I had left. And that's when I screamed. I screamed the way people scream in nightmares, the kind of scream that tears your throat raw and leaves you voiceless for days afterward. The vase dropped from my hands, shattering on the floor, and I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table, nearly falling, but somehow staying upright through sheer, desperate will. The thing was in my house now, in my living room, standing there, dripping and heaving and making that terrible breathing sound. And I was trapped. Trapped in my own home with something I couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't fight. "Arthur," I thought. "Arthur, help me." But Arthur was gone, and I was alone. The thing shook itself violently, sending water flying in every direction. I pressed myself against the far wall, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, in my temples, in every pulse point of my body. The scream had emptied my lungs, and now I couldn't seem to fill them again. Couldn't get enough air, couldn't do anything but stand there and watch as this creature, this intruder, this nightmare made itself at home in my living room. The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of brightness, I caught a glimpse of something. Dark fur, massive body, a shape that was familiar but that my terrified brain refused to recognize. And then I heard a voice. "Maggie! Maggie, are you all right?" A man's voice. Coming from outside, from the porch, getting closer. I knew that voice. Knew it the way you know the voices of people who have been part of your life for years, even if you don't see them every day. Harold Brenner, my neighbor from 3 houses down. "Maggie, I'm so sorry. He got away from me." The porch light flickered on, casting a yellow glow through the open sliding door. And suddenly, I could see clearly what had invaded my home, what had burst through my door and made me scream loud enough to wake the dead. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a burglar. It wasn't any of the terrible things my imagination had conjured in those few seconds of pure terror. It was a dog. A massive, soaking wet, absolutely enormous dog. I recognized him now. Bear. The Brenner's Newfoundland. A giant of an animal, easily 150 pounds, with a thick black coat that was currently plastered to his body and dripping puddles onto my hardwood floor. He was standing in the middle of my living room, panting heavily, his big brown eyes looking at me with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. Harold appeared in the doorway, rain streaming down his face, his old yellow slicker doing little to keep him dry. He was 78 years old and looked every bit of it in that moment, hunched against the wind, his white hair plastered to his forehead. "Lord, Maggie, I'm so sorry," he said, stepping inside and immediately slipping on the wet floor. He caught himself on the doorframe, steadied himself, and looked at me with a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "Are you okay? I heard you scream clear from my yard." I couldn't speak. My voice had abandoned me completely. All I could do was stand there, pressed against the wall, staring at the dog that had nearly given me a heart attack. "The storm spooked him," Harold continued, still breathing hard from what must have been a chase through the neighborhood. "Linda was giving him his dinner when a branch came down in the backyard, made a terrible crash. Bear bolted right through the screen door, took off running. I've been chasing him for 15 minutes. Bear, perhaps sensing that he was the subject of conversation, lowered his massive head and let out a soft whimper. His tail, which under normal circumstances probably wagged with endless enthusiasm, was tucked firmly between his legs. He was as scared as I had been, I realized. Maybe more. "Your door was open," Harold said, gesturing vaguely at the sliding glass. "Well, not open exactly, but the lock must have given out. Bear pushed right through it. I tried to catch him, but he's faster than he looks, and these old legs aren't what they used to be." I finally found my voice. It came out as a croak, barely recognizable as human. "A dog," I said. "It was just a dog." "Just a dog." Harold let out a weary laugh. "Well, I suppose that's one way to describe 150 pounds of terrified Newfoundland." The adrenaline that had been flooding my system started to ebb, leaving behind a shaky weakness that made my knees threaten to buckle. I slid down the wall, not quite falling, but not quite standing either, ending up in an awkward half-crouch that probably looked ridiculous, but was all my body could manage. "Maggie?" Harold's voice was sharp with concern now. "Maggie, are you all right? Should I call someone? An ambulance?" "No." I held up a hand, waving away his worry. "No, I'm fine. I need a minute." Bear chose that moment to approach me. Slowly, hesitantly, like he knew he was in trouble and was trying to apologize. He crossed the wet floor with careful steps, his massive paws leaving prints on the hardwood, and stopped about a foot away from where I was crouched. Then he lowered his head even further and looked up at me with those big, sad, impossibly gentle eyes. And despite everything, despite the terror and the racing heart and the scream that had scraped my throat raw, I felt something shift inside me. He was just scared. Just a scared animal looking for somewhere safe to hide. The storm that had frightened me, with its howling wind and pounding rain, had terrified him even more. He hadn't meant to break into my house, hadn't meant to scare me. He had just been running from thunder and lightning and crashing branches, running until he found an opening, a doorway, a place that wasn't the terrible loud outside. "You poor thing," I heard myself say. "You poor, silly, enormous thing." Bear's tail gave a tentative wag. Just once. Just enough to show that he understood the tone, if not the words. And I started to laugh. The laughter came out of nowhere, surprising me as much as it surprised Harold. It started as a giggle, the kind of nervous release that happens when tension breaks. Then it grew, bubbling up from somewhere deep inside, until I was laughing so hard that tears were streaming down my face and my stomach ached. I couldn't stop. Every time I looked at Bear, at his dripping fur and his guilty expression and his tail that was starting to wag more confidently now, the laughter came back stronger. Harold watched me with growing concern, probably wondering if the shock had broken something in my brain. And maybe it had. Maybe something had cracked open, something that had been sealed shut for too long. Because the laughter felt good. It felt like medicine. It felt like the first deep breath after being underwater for too long. "Maggie?" Harold took a tentative step toward me. "Are you sure you're all right?" I gasped between laughs, trying to get the words out. I thought it was a burglar. Or worse, I was standing here with that ugly vase, ready to fight for my life, and it was just your dog. Harold's worried expression slowly melted into a smile, then a chuckle, then a full-bodied laugh that matched my own. The two of us stood there in my waterlogged living room, laughing like fools while Bear looked back and forth between us with the confused expression that dogs get when humans do something they don't understand. "I'm so sorry," Harold said again when he finally caught his breath. "Linda's going to kill me when she hears about this. She's always saying I need to fix that screen door, that Bear's too strong for it, and now look what happened. It's not your fault." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, still hiccuping with leftover laughter. "The lock on that sliding door has been acting up for months. I kept meaning to get it fixed, but you know how it is. You put things off, and put them off, and then a 150-pound dog breaks into your house during a storm." "Exactly." Bear, sensing that the mood had shifted, finally relaxed enough to move. He padded over to the couch, considered it for a moment, then seemed to decide that he had caused enough trouble already. Instead of jumping up onto the furniture, he lowered himself to the floor with a heavy sigh and rested his massive head on his paws. "He's exhausted," Harold said, looking at the dog with a mixture of affection and exasperation. "Poor old boy. He's been terrified of storms his whole life. Thunder sends him into a panic. We usually put him in the basement with some music playing to drown out the noise, but tonight Linda wanted to feed him first. And then the branch fell. And then the branch fell. And he was gone before we could even react." I looked at Bear, really looked at him for the first time since the terror had subsided. He was trembling slightly, even now that he was indoors and safe. His eyes kept darting toward the windows every time the wind gusted or the rain intensified. This massive creature, this beast that had scared me half to death, was as frightened as a child during a nightmare. Something softened in my chest, something that had been hard and closed for a very long time. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked Harold. "Or tea? I was just about to make some chamomile before all this excitement. I should probably get Bear home. Linda must be worried sick. In this weather?" I gestured toward the sliding door, which was still hanging open, rain blowing in with every gust. "You'll both catch pneumonia. At least wait until it lets up a little." Harold hesitated, looking out at the storm. It showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, it had intensified in the last few minutes, the wind howling even louder, the rain coming down in sheets that made it impossible to see more than a few feet. "I suppose you're right," he admitted. "If you don't mind the company." "Mind? Harold, I haven't had company in this house after dark in I don't even know how long. Please, sit. Let me make us something warm." I went to the kitchen, grateful for a task to focus on, something to do with my hands that were still shaking slightly from the aftermath of adrenaline. As I filled the kettle and set it on the stove, I could hear Harold moving around the living room, probably trying to clean up some of the water that Bear had spread everywhere. "Leave it," I called out. "I'll deal with it later. Just sit down and rest. At least let me close this door properly. Do you have something I can wedge against it to keep it shut until you can get the lock fixed?" "There's a wooden dowel in the hall closet. Arthur used to use it as a security bar." I heard Harold rummaging around, heard the sound of the door sliding shut and something being wedged into place. The howling of the wind became muffled, more distant, and the temperature in the house immediately began to feel more comfortable. When I came back with 2 cups of chamomile tea, Harold was sitting in Arthur's old armchair. For a moment, just a brief flash, I saw my husband there instead. The same posture, the same tired slump, the same way of holding himself after a long day. The image was so vivid, so real, that I nearly dropped the cups. But then I blinked, and it was just Harold. Just my neighbor of 15 years, a good man who had chased his scared dog through a storm and ended up in my living room by accident. "Thank you," he said, taking the cup I offered. "And I really am sorry about all this, Maggie. I know it must have been terrifying." "It was," I admitted, sitting down on the couch. but it's also the most excitement I've had in years." We both looked at Bear, who had begun to snore softly on my floor. And despite everything, I smiled. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping our tea, listening to the storm rage outside. It felt strange, having someone else in the house at this hour. Strange, but not unpleasant. For 12 years, these evening hours had belonged to solitude, to the quiet ritual of a woman living alone. Tea and books, and the soft glow of lamps, the sound of the clock ticking in the hallway. The creak of the house settling around me like an old friend. But tonight there was another presence. 2 other presences, actually, if you counted the massive dog snoring on my living room floor. And instead of feeling intruded upon, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt less alone. "Linda worries about me in storms like this," Harold said, breaking the silence. "She always has. Says I'm too old to be chasing after dogs in bad weather, too stubborn to admit when I need help. She sounds like a wise woman." "She is. Smarter than me, that's for sure. Always has been." He smiled, that soft smile that people get when they talk about someone they've loved for a long time. "We've been married 52 years. Can you believe that? 52 years with the same woman, and I still don't understand how she thinks." "Arthur and I had 41, I said. "And I never figured him out either. Maybe that's the secret, keeping the mystery alive." Harold chuckled. "Maybe so. Maybe so." Bear shifted in his sleep, his paws twitching like he was running in a dream, probably chasing squirrels or rabbits or whatever it was that dogs dreamed about. The storm didn't seem to bother him anymore now that he was inside, safe, surrounded by warmth and the smell of chamomile tea. "Can I ask you something, Maggie?" Harold's voice was hesitant, like he wasn't sure he should speak. "And you don't have to answer if you don't want to. Go ahead. How do you do it? Living alone, I mean. After losing Arthur." He paused, staring into his teacup. "Linda and I talk about it sometimes. What would happen if one of us went first? How the other one would manage? And I'll be honest with you, Maggie, the thought terrifies me." The question caught me off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because no one had ever asked me that so directly. People tiptoed around the subject of Arthur's death, around the subject of my solitude. They offered platitudes and casseroles and invitations to church functions, but they never actually asked how I survived. "I don't know that I have a good answer," I said slowly. "The first year was hard. Harder than hard. There were days when I didn't get out of bed, days when I forgot to eat, days when I wondered what the point of any of it was. But you kept going." "I kept going, not because I wanted to necessarily, but because, I don't know. Because Arthur would have wanted me to. Because my children needed to know their mother was okay. Because giving up felt like betraying everything we had built together." Harold nodded, understanding in his eyes. "But if I'm being honest," I continued, "I've made it smaller than it should be. My life, I mean. I've shrunk it down to just the essentials. Wake up, eat, read, sleep, repeat. I tell myself it's enough, that I don't need more, that this is just what life looks like when you're 75 and widowed. But it isn't enough. No." The word came out as a whisper. "No, it isn't." But I didn't know what else to do. Everyone I knew was busy with their own lives. My children are far away, my friends from the library have moved or passed on. And somewhere along the line, I just stopped reaching out, stopped trying. The confession hung in the air between us. I hadn't meant to say so much, hadn't meant to open up like this to a man I barely knew, despite living 3 houses apart for 15 years. But there was something about this night, this strange and terrifying and unexpectedly wonderful night, that made honesty feel not just possible, but necessary. "Linda says I'd do the same thing," Harold said quietly. "She says I've gotten so used to being retired, to being home all the time, that I've forgotten how to be part of the world. She pushes me to go to the senior center, to join clubs, to make friends. But it's hard. At our age, making new connections feels impossible. Yes, impossible. Like all the friendship slots in your life are already filled, and there's no room for anyone new. I looked at him. This man I had waved to across driveways and exchanged pleasantries with over mailboxes, but never really known. This man who had chased his scared dog through a storm and ended up in my living room, drinking my tea, sharing secrets we had both kept locked away. Maybe we've been wrong, I said. Both of us. Maybe there's always room for someone new. We just have to be willing to let them in. Harold met my eyes. Something passed between us in that moment. Not romance, nothing like that. Something deeper, maybe. The recognition of two people who had been lonely for too long, who had forgotten that loneliness was a choice and not a sentence. You know, he said, Linda has been saying for years that we should have you over for dinner, and I always said yes, we should, we will, someday. But someday never came. I've done the same thing. Thought about inviting neighbors over, reconnecting with old friends. But thinking isn't doing. No, it isn't. Bear snorted in his sleep, his legs twitching again. We both looked at him and smiled. I think your dog might be trying to tell us something, I said. What's that? That sometimes you have to break down doors to make a connection. Harold laughed. A real laugh, warm and genuine. I think you might be right, Maggie. I think you might be absolutely right. The storm began to ease around 9 o'clock. The wind dropped first, going from a howl to a whisper over the course of half an hour. Then the rain softened, the violent drumming on the roof fading to a gentle patter that was almost soothing. Through the window, I could see the clouds starting to break apart, letting through glimpses of a moon that had been hidden all evening. Harold noticed too. He set down his empty teacup and looked toward the door with an expression that was half relief, half something else. Reluctance, maybe. The same reluctance I was feeling at the thought of this unexpected evening coming to an end. I should probably get this big guy home, he said, gesturing at Bear, who was still sprawled on my floor like he owned the place. Linda must be worried sick. I didn't even think to call her. Use my phone, I offered. It's in the kitchen. He went to make the call while I sat with Bear, stroking his massive head. The dog had woken up when Harold moved, but he seemed content to stay where he was, his tail thumping lazily against the floor every time I scratched behind his ears. I could hear Harold's voice from the kitchen, muffled but warm. The cadence of a man talking to his wife, explaining and reassuring, and probably apologizing. I thought about Arthur, about all the phone calls we had shared over 41 years of marriage. The mundane ones, the important ones, the ones that were just to hear each other's voice. I missed that, missed having someone to call, someone who cared where I was and when I was coming home. Harold returned a few minutes later, looking relieved. Linda's fine. A little annoyed that I didn't call sooner, but mostly just glad Bear is safe. He paused, then added with a small smile. She also said to thank you for taking care of both of us. I didn't do anything, just made some tea. You did more than that, Maggie. You let us in. You didn't have to. The words were simple, but they carried weight. I had let them in, not just physically, into my house, but in other ways too. I had let Harold see me vulnerable, frightened, lonely. I had shared things with him that I hadn't shared with anyone in years. And somehow, instead of feeling exposed, I felt lighter. Will you be okay getting home? I asked as he coaxed Bear to his feet. It's still wet out there. It's just 3 houses. I think we can manage. He hesitated at the door, the wooden dowel still wedged in place. Maggie, I meant what I said earlier, about having you over for dinner. I'm going to talk to Linda tomorrow, set a date. A real date, not a someday. I'd like that. Good. Because I think we've wasted enough time being neighbors who don't really know each other, don't you? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Harold removed the dowel and slid the door open. The night air rushed in, cool and clean, washed fresh by the storm. Bear bounded out onto the porch, suddenly energetic now that the thunder had stopped, his tail wagging with enthusiasm that seemed impossible for an animal who had been cowering in terror just hours ago. "Good night, Maggie," Harold said, stepping out after his dog. "And thank you for everything." "Good night, Harold. Tell Linda I said hello." "I will." I watched them walk down the path toward the sidewalk, Harold moving slowly, carefully, his old legs probably stiff from sitting so long. Bear pranced beside him, completely recovered from his ordeal, as if the whole terrifying evening had been nothing more than an adventure. At the edge of my property, Harold turned and waved. I waved back, standing in my doorway like I used to stand when Arthur left for work in the mornings, watching until he was out of sight. When they disappeared around the corner, I closed the door and stood alone in my living room. The silence was different now, not the heavy, oppressive silence of loneliness, but something softer, a peaceful quiet, like the pause between movements of a symphony. The house felt different too, warmer somehow, even though the fire had gone out. Like the presence of other people had left something behind, an echo of connection that lingered in the air. I looked at the floor where Bear had slept, at the water stains that were already starting to dry, at the shattered remains of that ugly vase still scattered across the hardwood, at Arthur's chair, where Harold had sat drinking chamomile tea and talking about loneliness and love and all the things we had both been too afraid to say out loud. What a strange night. What a terrifying, wonderful, unexpected night. I should have been exhausted, should have wanted nothing more than to clean up the mess, take a hot bath, and collapse into bed. But instead, I felt energized, alert, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I went to the kitchen and found a piece of paper and a pen. Before I could talk myself out of it, I started writing a list of names. People I had lost touch with over the years, friends from the library, neighbors I had never really gotten to know, acquaintances from church who had invited me to things I always declined. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow, I would start reaching out, making calls, writing notes, saying yes to invitations instead of finding excuses to stay home alone. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of rebuilding a life that had shrunk too small. But tonight, I would sit with this feeling. This unexpected gift that had burst through my door in the shape of a giant, terrified dog. Sometimes that's how change arrives, not gradually, not gently, but all at once, breaking down the doors we've locked against it. And all we can do is let it in. The invitation came 3 days later. Linda Brenner herself walked over with it, a handwritten note on pretty cream-colored stationery, the kind that people used to use for important correspondence before everything went digital. She stood on my porch with her silver hair perfectly curled and her smile warm as sunshine, and she handed me that note like it was a gift. "Saturday evening," she said. 6 o'clock. Nothing fancy, just pot roast and good company. And don't you dare say no, Margaret Ellsworth. Harold told me everything that happened, and I've decided we've been terrible neighbors for far too long. I tried to protest, tried to say she didn't need to go to any trouble, but Linda waved away my objections with a firm hand. "Nonsense. You took care of my husband and my dog during a storm. The least I can do is feed you a proper meal. Besides," she added with a twinkle in her eye, "Harold hasn't stopped talking about you since that night. Says you're the most interesting person he's met in years. I'm starting to get jealous." I laughed, something I had been doing more of lately. "Tell Harold he's very kind, but I'm just an old librarian with too many books and not enough excitement." "That's not what he says. He says you're wise and honest and exactly the kind of friend we should have made years ago." Linda reached out and squeezed my hand. "Saturday, 6 o'clock. I won't take no for an answer." So I went. I spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear, which was ridiculous for a casual dinner at a neighbor's house. But it had been so long since I'd gone anywhere that required real clothes instead of the comfortable house dresses I wore around the house. I finally settled on a blue cardigan that Catherine had given me for Christmas and a pair of slacks that still fit, thank goodness. The Brenner's house was warm and welcoming, filled with the smell of cooking meat and fresh bread. Bear greeted me at the door like an old friend, his tail wagging so hard his entire back end swung with it. He showed no signs of remembering the terror he'd experienced during the storm. Dogs are good that way. They don't hold on to fear the way people do. "Maggie!" Harold appeared behind Bear, gently pushing the dog aside so I could enter. "You came. Linda was worried you might change your mind." "I almost did," I admitted. "About 6 times. But I promised myself I'd stop making excuses." "Well, I'm glad you kept that promise. Come in, come in. Linda's in the kitchen, but dinner's almost ready." The evening was lovely. More than lovely, actually. It was the kind of evening I had forgotten existed, full of good food and easy conversation and laughter that came naturally instead of being forced. Linda was everything Harold had described, and more, a woman of sharp wit and generous spirit who made me feel welcome from the first moment to the last. We talked about everything, about their children, scattered across the country like mine, about Harold's years working at the post office, about my decades at the library, about the neighborhood and how it had changed over the years, about the people who had come and gone, about the strange way time speeds up when you're not paying attention. And we talked about that night, the storm, the dog, the scream that Linda said she'd heard from 3 houses away. "I thought someone was being murdered," she said, refilling my wine glass. "I told Harold we should call the police, but then he called and explained what happened and I couldn't stop laughing. I'm sorry, Maggie. I know it must have been terrifying for you." "It was," I said. "But it was also exactly what I needed." "What do you mean?" I thought about how to explain it, how to put into words the way that night had shaken something loose inside me, had broken through walls I hadn't even known I'd built. "I'd been sleepwalking," I said finally. "For years, really, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. And then this huge, wet, terrified dog came crashing into my house, and suddenly I was awake again, really awake, for the first time since Arthur died." Harold and Linda exchanged a look, the kind of look that couples share when they understand something without having to speak. "Harold told me what you two talked about that night," Linda said gently. "About loneliness. About shrinking your life down to fit inside the grief." I probably said too much. "You said exactly enough, and it made us realize that we've been doing the same thing in our own way. We have each other, which is a blessing, but we'd stopped letting anyone else in, stopped making the effort to connect with people outside our little bubble." "It's easy to do," I said, "easier than it should be." "Well, not anymore." Linda raised her glass. "To new friendships, better late than never." We clinked glasses, the 3 of us, while Bear snored contentedly at our feet. After dinner, we sat in their living room and Linda brought out photo albums. Pictures of their children growing up, of vacations they'd taken, of the life they'd built together over 52 years. And I found myself sharing too, telling stories about Arthur, about William and Catherine, about the adventures and misadventures of raising a family. It felt good to remember out loud, to speak Arthur's name without crying, to laugh at the silly things he used to do, to keep him alive through stories instead of letting him fade into silent grief. When I finally left, it was nearly 11 o'clock, far later than I usually stayed up, but I didn't feel tired. I felt full. Full of food, yes, but also full of something else. Connection, belonging, the warmth of being seen and known and welcomed. "Same time next week?" Linda asked as she hugged me goodbye. "I'd love that." And I meant it. The weeks that followed were the fullest I had lived in 12 years. Saturday dinners at the Brenners became a standing appointment, as sacred as church on Sunday. But they weren't the only change. The list I had made that night, the names of people I had lost touch with, became a project. Every day I reached out to someone. A phone call here, A handwritten note there, an email to my son William, who had been begging me to learn technology for years. And people responded. That was the surprising part. I had convinced myself that everyone had moved on, that they had forgotten me, that I had waited too long to reconnect. But I was wrong. Dorothy from church was thrilled to hear from me and insisted we start having lunch together every Thursday. My old colleague from the library, Margaret Chen, drove 2 hours just to visit and spend an afternoon reminiscing about the patrons we had helped over the years. Even my daughter Catherine started calling more often, sensing something different in my voice, wanting to be part of whatever was happening. "You sound happy, Mom," she said during one of our Sunday evening calls. "Really happy, not just pretending." "I am happy," I told her. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, it was true. The sliding door got fixed. Harold insisted on doing it himself, showing up one morning with his toolbox and a determination that wouldn't take no for an answer. Linda came along with coffee and muffins, and the three of us spent the morning together while Harold worked. It should have taken an hour, but we kept getting distracted by conversation, by laughter, by Bear demanding attention from anyone who would give it. "There," Harold said finally, testing the new lock mechanism. "Solid as a rock. No more dogs breaking in uninvited." "What if I want dogs to break in?" I teased. "What if that's become my preferred method of making friends?" Linda laughed. "Then we'll have to find you another terrified Newfoundland. I'm sure there's a storm somewhere that can help." Bear, hearing his name, lumbered over and pressed his massive head against my leg. He had taken to visiting me even when Harold and Linda didn't come along. They had installed a dog door in their back fence, and Bear had figured out that my house was just a short walk away. He'd show up on my porch in the afternoons, waiting patiently until I noticed him and let him in. I didn't mind. I had grown to love that ridiculous animal. His gentle presence, his soft brown eyes, the way he sighed with contentment when he settled at my feet while I read. He filled a space I hadn't known was empty. "You know," Linda said one afternoon as we watched Bear sprawl across my living room floor, "you could get a dog of your own. It might be good for you. Company when we're not around." I had thought about it, had even looked at the local shelter's website, scrolling through pictures of animals who needed homes. But something held me back. "Maybe someday," I said. "For now, I'm happy sharing yours." The truth was, I wasn't sure I was ready for that level of commitment. A dog meant responsibility, meant being needed, meant having something that depended on you completely. Part of me wanted that. Another part was still learning how to depend on myself again. But other commitments came more easily. I started volunteering at the library, just a few hours a week, helping with the children's reading program. Being back among the books, among the hushed voices and turning pages, felt like coming home. The children reminded me why I had loved that job so much, their wonder at stories, their excitement at discovering new worlds between covers. William came to visit in November, bringing his wife and their 2 teenage sons. They stayed for a whole week, longer than they had visited in years. The house was full of noise and chaos and dirty dishes in the sink, and I loved every minute of it. "The house feels different," William said on their last evening, sitting with me on the porch while the boys played video games inside. "Warmer somehow, more alive." "I feel different," I admitted. "It took me a long time, but I finally figured out that living alone doesn't have to mean being alone." "Dad would be proud of you, Mom. You know that, right?" The mention of Arthur brought tears to my eyes, but they were different tears than they used to be. Not the sharp, cutting tears of fresh grief, but something softer. Bittersweet. The tears of missing someone you loved while also being grateful for the time you had. "I hope so," I said. "I hope he can see that I didn't give up, that I found my way back." William put his arm around me, and we sat together watching the stars come out. His son's laughter drifted through the window. Somewhere down the street, I could hear Bear barking at something, probably a squirrel or a cat or his own shadow. This is what life is supposed to feel like, I thought. Full. Connected. messy and complicated and absolutely worth living. It had taken a storm to show me that. A storm and a broken lock and a 150-pound dog who was more afraid of thunder than I was. Funny how life works sometimes. The things that terrify us the most turn out to be exactly what we needed. The doors we're afraid to open lead to the rooms we most need to enter, and the scream that tears from our throat in fear can become the first breath of a whole new life. It's been a year now since that stormy night. A year since a terrified dog broke through my sliding door and made me scream loud enough to wake the neighborhood. A year since I sat in my kitchen with a man I barely knew, drinking chamomile tea and confessing loneliness I had never admitted to anyone. A year since everything changed. I'm sitting on my porch as I tell you this story, watching the autumn leaves drift down from the old maple tree in my front yard. Bear is at my feet, snoring the way he always does, his massive body taking up most of the porch floor. He splits his time between my house and the Brenners now, and nobody seems to mind. Harold jokes that we have joint custody, like divorced parents sharing a child. The house behind me is different than it was a year ago. Not the structure itself, that's still the same cozy home that Arthur and I built our life in, but what it contains. The silence has been replaced by something warmer. Phone calls from friends, visits from neighbors, the occasional chaos of grandchildren when William or Catherine come to stay. Life has flowed back into these rooms, filling corners that had been empty for too long. Harold and Linda have become family. That's the only word for it. We have dinner together at least twice a week, alternating houses, taking turns cooking. We've traveled together, too, a trip to the Oregon coast last spring that I never would have taken on my own. We're planning another one for next year, maybe to see the fall colors in New England, something all three of us have always wanted to do. I finally got my own dog, a rescue named Penny, a sweet golden retriever mix who was found wandering alone on a highway, no collar, no chip, no one looking for her. When I saw her picture on the shelter website, something clicked. I knew she was meant to be mine. She and Bear are best friends, of course. They chase each other around the backyard, share treats, curl up together when the weather turns cold. Penny sleeps at the foot of my bed every night, and I can't imagine how I ever thought I preferred the silence. William calls every week now instead of every month. He says he can hear the difference in my voice, says I sound like the mother he remembers from childhood, before grief made me small. Catherine flew out for my 76th birthday, threw a party that filled this house with people I love. When she hugged me goodbye at the airport, she whispered, "Welcome back, Mom. Welcome back." As if I had been gone somewhere far away and finally found my way home. I suppose I had been. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light is soft and the world feels gentle, I talk to Arthur. Not out loud, not like he can hear me, but in my heart. I tell him about my days, about the friends I've made, about the life I'm living now. I tell him I'm sorry it took me so long to wake up, to remember that surviving isn't the same as living. And I like to think he's proud of me, that somewhere beyond the veil that separates us, he's smiling at the woman I've become. Not the shadow I was for those 12 years, but someone fuller, brighter, more like the person he married all those decades ago. I still miss him. That will never change. You don't spend 41 years loving someone and then stop just because they're gone. But the missing has transformed. It's no longer a weight that pins me down, but a thread that connects me to the past while allowing me to move forward into the future. That's what I've learned this year. That grief and joy can coexist. That you can honor what you've lost while embracing what you found. That opening your heart to new love doesn't diminish the old love. It expands it, makes room for more. Bear stirs at my feet, lifting his massive head to look at me with those gentle brown eyes. His tail thumps against the porch floor, once, twice, then settles. He knows I'm thinking about that night, the night he burst into my life and changed everything. Dogs have a way of knowing these things. "You ridiculous animal," I say, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Do you have any idea what you did? He sighs contentedly and closes his eyes. I think he knows. A car pulls into the driveway next door, and I see Harold getting out, waving in my direction. Linda appears on their porch a moment later, calling out something about fresh apple pie and asking if I want to come over. I wave back, already getting to my feet. Bear rises too, tail wagging, ready for whatever comes next. That's how I try to live now, ready for whatever comes next. Open to surprise, to connection, to the unexpected gifts that arrive when you least expect them. Even the scary ones. Especially the scary ones. Because sometimes the things that burst into our lives and terrify us at first are exactly what we needed. Sometimes protection arrives in strange forms. Sometimes love breaks down doors. And sometimes a scream of fear becomes the first note of a whole new song. My name is Margaret Ellsworth. I'm 76 years old. And on a stormy night 1 year ago, something big came in fast, and I screamed so loud I nearly scared myself to death. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. Thanks be to God, and thanks be to Bear.